Hey guys, welcome to another FamiStudio mini tutorial. This tutorial will be about how to sample a few notes of an instrument to cover a few octaves of the keyboard and use this instrument in FamiStudio. So it's essentially going to be a more advanced follow-up to the tutorial that was called Editing DPCM Samples that I posted a few months ago. This previous tutorial was recorded with an older version, but still 99% of what I say still applies in this newer version. So I really recommend that you watch this old tutorial before watching this one. It's going to really show you the DPCM samples workflow in FamiStudio. If you are just planning on sampling percussion sounds like kick drums or snare, then this first tutorial will be plenty. You don't need to watch this one. It's also going to try to show kind of the challenges and limitation of sampling real instrument. The NES or Famicom hardware was quite limited, so your expectations in terms of quality should be quite low to begin with. We're going to be using three free tools for this. What I'm going to show you is not meant here to be an exact recipe to follow, but more an example of a workflow you can use to sample your own instruments. And as you understand what I'm doing, you can kind of swap the tools I'm using for your favorite ones. So the first tool we're going to be using is obviously FamiStudio. We're also going to be using Audacity to tweak our WAV files, and also we're going to be using Sforzendo, which is a very simple and free sound font player. In case you don't know, sound fonts are typically files containing very high quality sample instruments. So this video is going to be in two parts. We will first sample a slap bass from a sound font, and in the second part we're going to be focusing on looping samples. So this is kind of just an excuse to discuss the limitation of looping samples on the NES. One of the instruments that was successfully sampled and used on an NES is a bass. The most classic example of this would be the Sons of Bass that you've heard in Gimmick and Journey to Silius. So I thought it would be appropriate to sample a bass instrument here. We're going to try to sample a slap bass. This will be done in 4 steps. We will first create a very simple MIDI file inside FamiStudio. We will then use Sforzendo to render that MIDI file into a WAV file using the slap bass sound that we want. We will then load that up into Audacity and chop it up into 5 individual samples, and we will finally load these samples inside FamiStudio. So inside FamiStudio here, the first thing we're going to do is to create a very simple MIDI file that contains exactly 5 notes: A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and D. The reason for this is that the NES can play samples only at their original pitch or lower, but only with very specific frequencies. So it turns out by using a very tight cluster of 5 semitones, you can cover a few octaves of the keyboard. There's going to be more on that later, bear with me. Here I'm going to be clustering the notes around C, so 2 semitones below and 2 semitones above, so to create those 5 semitones. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to set the notes per pattern to 20 to create kind of a 5/4 time signature. It really doesn't matter, it's just that I have 5 notes to put inside this pattern, so I'm giving myself some space to work with. So here I'm going to start drawing the note, drawing A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and D. Here, if you zoom in, I'm drawing these notes 30 frames in length. This is going to become a little bit clearer later why I'm doing this, but right now, this is just what we're going to do. Since I don't know how my bass will sound, at which octave I really like the sound, what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to replicate this pattern like 4 times, and I'm going to transpose at various octaves. This way I don't have to do a lot of back and forth between FamiStudio and Sforzendo. I can just pick the octaves that I really like. And I'm going to set the song length to 4, because we just have 4 patterns here. And I'm going to export this as a MIDI file. Let's call this slapbass.mid. Now let's open up Sforzendo. The slap bass sound I'm going to be using comes from a free super generic sound font that I found on the internet. I'll put a link on the description below. So it's called Yamaha something, and it's in the 00 section. It's called Slap Bass 1. Sounds pretty good. Nothing special, but that's what we're going to use here. The single function we're going to use from Sforzendo is in the Tools folder menu here. It's called Render Offline. What it does is that we're going to give it a MIDI file, and we're going to give it a WAV file to generate. So it's going to render that MIDI file using the slap bass that we want, and it's going to output a WAV file. Here I'm going to press render, and we are done with Sforzendo. Now let's see how it sounds in Audacity. So I can open the file. There you go. So if you remember, we drew 5 notes over 4 octaves, so we're seeing approximately 20 notes, so that checks out. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to mix this down to mono. We don't need stereo. And then I'm going to try to find the octave that I think sounds the best for what we want to do. All right, I can already tell that it's the second one, so I'm going to delete everything else. Here I'm going to add 5 new mono tracks because I'm going to split those up into individual tracks. There you go. And here I'm just going to copy those into their own tracks. So this should be a C sharp. This should be D. Go. We don't need that original one anymore. The last thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to try to truncate the beginning so they all have quite similar attack. I'm working fast here, but take your time and try to do a better job than I'm doing here. And finally, the one last thing I'm going to do here, okay, because I said earlier the NES can only play samples at their original pitch or below, and I kind of picked this middle sounding octave here, so what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to double the pitch and the speed of these samples to raise them up by 1 octave, and this is going to allow me to pitch it down again using the NES hardware. So here I'm just going to select everything, go in the effects menu, change speed, and just set that to 2. And okay, so here if I solo this, there we go, we are now 1 octave higher. So here I'm just going to export each of those into a separate wave file, slap bass, and so this should be our A sharp, this should be our B, this is our C, this is our C sharp, and finally our D. All right, we are done with Audacity. Now let's go load these up inside FamiStudio. We're going to click the little folder icon here next to DPCM samples. We're going to load all these up at once. We can hear the original samples or the converted samples. So as you can see, they are quite noisier. This is kind of the nature of these DPCM 1-bit samples. They, at each point in time, the sample will either go down by a fixed amount or up by a fixed amount, which create these kind of jaggies and introduce a lot of noise. But this is kind of the nature of these samples. There's not much we can do about this. The one thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to enable the trim 0 volume option on all of them because this is going to get rid of these kind of silence at the end and make them smaller. I could have done this in Audacity, but yeah, I can do it here as well. All right. So another thing I want to show you is that the reason at the very beginning when we created the MIDI file, why I chose 30 frames as a length is because I knew I was going to double the pitch, and I was kind of aiming for about 1/4 of a second for each sample. Here we have 258 milliseconds, which is really, really close. This number comes from the fact that the Sunsoft bass was about also 1/4 of a second per sample, so I was kind of aiming for that. So that's kind of the reasoning behind this. All right, now we want to assign those samples to keys of the piano. So we're going to click the DPCM instrument here, the little waveform here, and we're simply going to drag those on the appropriate keys. So here, the A sharp, the B, let me zoom in for you, C, C sharp, and the D. There you go. So I told you earlier we can play the sample at their original pitch, which we're doing right now, or we can play them at lower pitches. So here I'm just going to put the C again, but I'm going to put it on G. I'm going to double click on the sample here, and here we're going to have the list of semitones that we can kind of transpose by. So for example, if we want to transpose by 5 semitones, the best match we have is about 4.98 semitones. So if I choose this, we have a C and we have a G. So one thing to note here, obviously, these semitones value, they are not even numbered. They have decimal places. So this means that things are going to be out of tune. And this is something we have to be ready to live with. We're going to talk about this later. There's some workaround we can do. But yeah, this is the reality of the NES. All right. Also, another thing to know is that as you start filling the rest of the keyboards, sometimes, because we start with those 5 samples, sometimes there are going to be multiple samples that can be used for a single key, and you're going to have choices to make. Here, to help myself, I created myself a spreadsheet that tells me for each note what is the best matching kind of sample and the best matching pitch, but these are not universal. Some people use different values. There's compromise to be made, so this is just one way to do it. Just be aware there are some other ways. So here, because it's kind of time consuming and kind of boring, I'm just going to cut the video. I'm going to fill in the rest of the keyboards all the way down to maybe C2, and I'll get back to you in a second. All right, I've assigned the samples all the way down to C2, so I can... There you go. This is how it sounds. I could have gone a little bit lower, but I got lazy in the end. Let's save this as a FamiStudio file, and we're going to try to see how it sounds in a real song, just for fun. So here I'm just going to open the Journey to Celius demo song, and what we're going to do, we're going to remove the soundfont bass and replace it with our custom slap bass. So here I'm just going to delete all the samples here, and I'm going to open an instrument, and I'm going to select the slap bass that I just created, and I'm going to load the DPCM instrument from that project. So as you can see, it loaded up all the samples, and we have our slap bass. There you go. So we're going to give this a listen and see if there are any issues we can spot. Okay, there's a couple things right away, right off the bat, we can spot. First of all, it's not quite loud enough. The soundfont bass was a tiny bit louder, so I'm going to just give this a little bit of a boost, maybe 33%. I'm just eyeballing here. There you go. All right, the second thing that should be super obvious here is that it is out of tune, terribly out of tune. Again, this is what I was talking about here. There are some compromises to be made when we're doing this transposition here, because we have this C note that's playing here. This is super important that this note is in tune. The little one that are playing up and down here, there are less importance because they are much shorter. So what we're going to do here, we're going to be using the fine-tuning parameter on that C, and we're going to bring it down to maybe something like 97 or something. I'm just eyeballing here, and let's listen. There you go. It's a lot better. It's not perfect. You can try to finish it and put some more time to make it sound better. But the lesson here is that there are going to be choices to be made. Not every note can be in tune, at least not when you're using only 5 samples to begin with. You would need more samples if you want to be more in tune. Now for the second part of the video, we're going to be looking at looping samples. Looping samples have not been used a lot on the NES. There are some serious limitations that makes them really hard to use in general. We're going to try it anyway here. It's going to be a very simple 2-step process. We're going to first process the waveform inside Audacity, and then we're going to load it up in FamiStudio, and we're going to be using the same procedure, using 5 semitones and then mapping it to the keys of the keyboard. While you could start with a square wave or sawtooth wave, these tend not to work really well with DPCM since they have very sharp rising and falling edges. Triangle waveform work really well, but they're not very interesting for like a tutorial. So I picked this kind of random waveform that I found online. I found a pack of looping waveform. I'll put a link in the description. So let's give this a listen. Okay, it's not terribly terribly interesting sound, but you know, this is just an example. You should still, though, be looking for waveforms that are somewhat smooth. They will tend to work a lot better than things with sharp edges, as I just said. So here it's going to be very simple what we're going to do. I'm basically going to extend this to about 200 milliseconds by just copying and pasting a few times. We're almost there. Okay, this is good enough. Here, because this sample was already looping to begin with, we don't have to be that careful because the end point already matches the beginning point. So a lot of that work has been done for us. But if you're just using a generic waveform, you will have to make sure that the very end of your wave matches perfectly with the beginning, just so you're aware of this. Another thing I'm going to do here, it's a little bit too loud. It's actually extremely loud. I'm just going to remove maybe 6 dB. This is better. Also, this note happens to be a C. I double-checked earlier. We want to create these kind of 5 semitones. So here I'm gonna add a bunch of new track. There you go. I'm gonna duplicate this 5 times. There you go. And then I'm gonna just speed or slow these down so we can have our 5 semitones here. If I select all of that, I can use the speed effect again here. And I'm just gonna be using the ratio of these pitches relative to C. So this would be A sharp. Here I can change the speed for a B, that would be this. This is already a C, so we're good. Change speed. This would be our C sharp, and this is going to be our D. 1.122. Right. I'm just going to export these as separate waveform. Let's call this looping. So as I said, this is our A sharp. This is our B. C. C sharp. And this is our D. All right, now let's go back to FamiStudio and load these up. I'm going to clear this. Loading those all at once. There you go. Looks good. All right, so let's assign those to keys of the keyboard and see what happens. See if we run into any kind of issues. Here I'm assigning the 5 semitones just like we did earlier. Nothing special. The only difference here, I'm going to enable the looping flag on all of those because that's the goal here. We want to create looping samples that are kind of simulate a continuous tone. Now let's give this a listen and see if there's anything wrong. Do you notice the popping that's happening here? Let me try to explain to you why this is happening. So as you can see here in gray, this is our original waveform, and in blue, let me pick another color that's a little bit brighter here. In orange here, we have our process waveform, and it kind of ends with a bunch of zigzaggy things. So why is this? The NES has very specific sample sizes that it accepts. So very specifically, it wants every sample to be a multiple of 16 bytes plus 1. There's some debates whether that plus 1 is actually a hardware bug or not. This is not really important for us, but just know that the hardware expects a very specific size. By default, FamiStudio will just pad this with a bunch of 0. This is the best you can do for 0, just up and down, up and down, up and down. This means that, like for example, for our slap bass, this wasn't an issue, just terminated with a bunch of silence. It was fine. Here, we don't want the silence. We would like the end of the sample to perfectly match the beginning. Here, if we go in the options here, you're going to see there's a padding mode. We're going to use the padding that's called round to 16 plus 1. So what this is going to do is that it's going to ensure that the sample ends perfectly where it should. But the compromise that we're going to make here is that to do this, FamiStudio will have to kind of compress slightly the waveform here. So as you can see here, our waveform is ever so slightly misaligned with the original one, which means that it's going to be out of tune. This is the compromise we're making here. So here I'm just going to enable the round plus 16 to 16 plus 1 on all of those. By the way, you can read more on these padding things on the NES Dev Wiki if you're really curious about how the whole thing works on hardware. And now we can listen to how it sounds now. This is a lot better. You can even see on the oscilloscope here we have a very clear signal. Hey, this is Matt from the future. As I was editing the video, I realized I forgot to mention something quite important. If you look here at the beginning of the sample, you're going to see that it starts kind of at the 0 point and kind of climbs up to reach the actual wave file. This is normal. We need to tell FamiStudio what is the starting point of our DMC data. So it's going to be done by using this parameter, the DMC initial value. So here, as I'm playing with it, you can see I'm kind of eyeballing here. Here, I find that it approximates the shape really, really well. So let's give this a listen. There you go. It sounds a lot better. So assume that I've done that for the rest of the tutorial, and I'll leave you with past Matt. All right, so we're gonna do exactly like last time. I'm gonna map all of these enabling the looping flag and transposing those to be able to do a C and a G and all that stuff. This is kind of boring, so I'm just going to cut the video and get back to you in a second. All right, guys, I'm back. I've mapped all the sample to all the keys of the keyboard. It's not a especially interesting sound, but it proves the point that you can do looping samples. So what should we do now? Maybe we can give this a listen in one of the other demo songs. So I thought it'd be interesting for maybe to try to swap the triangle channel of the tutorial song. So what I did here, I already saved this file as looping.fms. So we're going to open the tutorial song in the demo song. This is the song. All right, we're going to delete all the samples here, and we're going to open our looping.fms and import the DPCM instrument. It imported all our samples. And here I'm just going to select everything on the triangle channel and just move it on the DPCM and see how it sounds. I don't think it's going to sound very good, but let's see. There you go. I'm not sure what was the point of this, but at least now you can, you know how looping samples work in FamiStudio and in general on the NES. That's all I have for you today. As you can see, the DPCM channel on the NES is not easy to work with, but you can probably get some interesting sounds out of it. If you spend a little bit more time than I did in this tutorial, you probably can get some nice results. I'll put the link in the description for all the various things I used so you can replicate this on your side. Good luck!